Yeah, everybody acts like it's raining and cold out, right? Y'all brave through the elements to get up here. I've I've figured out that now if whenever I see the lines on the highway where the salt is or whatever that the city does, that it must be fixing to get cold because it must be fixing to be rainy and cold. At least a chance of it. But yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Now they put it out yesterday. Yeah, like they were afraid that maybe it would freeze over. Well, I'm not. I don't know how cold it is. I don't want to. I don't need to get into that. No, no. I'm not terribly old, but I was not born yesterday. So, oh shoot. Yeah. Well, you will not get a disagreement from me on that. I've never questioned that. Mm-mm-mm. Yeah, that's why, right? 47 years, and every day is a new day. That's right. Exactly right. No doubt. Well, prayer request? Miss Bishop? Oh, yeah. Hmm. Yeah. She's kind of in that window. Hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Two fronts. Hate it for her, hate it for you, right? That's right. That's two sides. Yeah, for sure, for sure. Hey, Norm. Deal. Anybody else? All right. Oh, awesome. Stephanie's baby. Yeah, awesome. 211. Mm. Oh, wow. That's great. Amazing what they can do at such a young age. I mean, just not, it's not even an age. Right. Sure. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Right. Made a big difference. That's great. Good deal. All right. Roger, would you lead us in prayer? All right. Y'all turn to Deuteronomy. I better get my glasses, and we're not going to get very far. I'm a grandpa now, you know. Yeah, it's nice because now I can blame so many more things on old age, you know. Oh, I can't decide what I'd rather have, you know, as if it's mine, but you know, you know, I don't know if I want to talk her into a boy or a girl yet, you know, but yeah, you know, yeah, that's right. Okay, wait a minute now, yeah, you know oh yeah, absolutely. The boy side of me is like, well, you know, we've already had two of those, you know, and I don't know how that turned out yet, really. So with boy, yeah, you're the opposite. Yeah, it's funny because when Michaela and Nate told Jen's mom and dad, then one of the first things he said was, well, you know, we get first dibs on him or her. I think he said her staying at the house because when we had Nate and Derek, um, I bet I bet Nate wasn't probably 6 months old, and he was already staying over there. They just couldn't, you know. It's funny because whenever we sat down to tell them, we sat down. It was I don't remember what time it was. Had to be in the summer or something. But anyway, we sat down with them and said, you know, well, we just thought we need to tell y'all that you know you're gonna have to buy some extra presents for Christmas. And then they kind of looked funny and looked at Jen like, "You're pregnant?" And she's like, "Yeah." So we're expecting this jubilant, you know, oh my gosh. And they just kind of sat there and looked at each other a little bit, didn't really say anything at all, and got up, went into their bedroom. So I mean, that's exactly what we did. We just kind of looked at each other and was like, "Well, that's really not the response I expected." You know, I kind of expected this when I asked to marry you, not really, you know, whenever you are gonna fix to have a grandkid. But yeah, it was their first, and so anyway, they just didn't. So you know, they came back in a little bit later. We talked a little bit more, but by the next day, they bought clothes and toys and you know everything already. So yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah. So anyway, it's fun times. Fun times. Deuteronomy 32, Song of Moses, really gives us just a great picture of the stability that we as a covenant people, if you're looking, I'm not equating us as Israel, but any covenant people that God has made a covenant with, the stability that we have in Him, one, knowing what is and what is to come, and Him being faithful to His word. And so the Song of Moses is a song that is not like what we would sing. I think we talked about that a couple weeks ago. Not really like what we would sing because it's really talking about um, God's faithfulness, their failure, God's vindication, then using another people to judge his people, how he is vindicated in doing that. So um, when when God makes a covenant with His people, He always shows Himself faithful. I actually read through Deuteronomy and Joshua again today, and one of the things that kind of got brought back to mind is at the end of Joshua, there we'll find that there are chapters devoted to the land that was inherited. I mean, just it's like going to a title company, you know, or and just you know, why spend so much time on that? And the answer to that is because God showed Himself to be faithful to His word. What God said that He was going to do, He's going to do. He will do that. So the promises of God in relation to what he has promised to a covenant people on his behalf, he is going to fulfill. Now, the failure of the people then, what does that mean? God then judges them as he would, and I would probably prefer to use the term, because of the way we think about judge, disciplines his children because they're his children. And it's actually a display of love. But when he does that, he uses another people to come in and discipline them. So he uses, if you will, an outside entity or source, this being other nations and people, Canaanites and Amalekites, just another group of people, and comes in. Philistines, you see a lot of Philistines coming in, judges his people, but then God judges them. Right? So he doesn't just discipline his children by using another group of people, disciplining them. Then he disciplines the Philistines who God is using to discipline, he judges, I should say, the Philistines that God is using to discipline his kids. Well, how is that right? And really the Song of Moses helps sort that stuff out. How is that right? How can God say, I'm using this group of people to judge my children and discipline my children, and it's better for them, it's actually an act of grace, but what they're doing to my children also is not right. So there's a sense in which it's good, but it's not right in a sense. So now I'm going to discipline them in relation to that. And the Song of Moses really sorts out a lot. So you get a lot of, one, the character and nature of promises that God makes, how we should respond to them, but normally do in terms of sometimes failure. And then God vindicating himself, discipline his children, using another group in relation to do that, but then vindicating himself in terms of who he is to everyone that's involved, all parties involved. Those that are involved in the discipline, those that are involved that are doing the discipline, receiving the discipline, doing the discipline, those that are involved in relation to watching. This is why when we start talking about heaven, I don't think that there's going to be anything in terms of history that's going to be hidden. I think that the fact that we are going to know what's happened and happening on this earth is going to be something that is a prerequisite in heaven. And whenever we talk about how there's going to be no tears in heaven, which means there's going to basically be a memory erase, I say that just can't be. Because in that sense, we're not going to see how God truly is a good, gracious, just God for all of eternity. Now, that brings some conflict within our soul because there are things that we see that we just don't say, how are those things right? How can God truly be shown as a loving, kind, just God, and you still see these things? How those two things in our economy just don't seem like they equate. But when we are on the other side of heaven, we're going to see those things differently. Okay, but we have glimpses of that on this side. I'm gonna botch this story up. I'm trying to think if I can even say it, but so a father and his child, they're going to travel on a journey, and as they're traveling on a journey, they were going to stop. They got to stop in a town because the journey is too far to make it in one day. So it's actually going to take 3 days. So they're going to have 2 stops before they can conduct their business. And the first stop, they come to a country farm, and a man and his wife live there, and they ask if they can stay. And the farm owner says, you can, but we really don't have next to anything. He said, we'll let you stay in a room, but he said, all we've got is this cow, but he said it does produce milk, and he said, we'll give you some of the milk from that cow. And he said, really, this cow is how we make our living in relation to that. And so the man and his son do. The young boy stays, drink the milk, and they get up in the morning to the sound of that elderly man and his wife crying, just sobbing. And come to find out, the cow died. And so the man says, we're going to cut the cow up and preserve it, the meat, in order that we'll have something to eat. And the father of the young boy said, no, he said, tell you what you do, take that cow and go plant it. He says, there's an olive tree there outside your farm. He said, dig a hole and bury your cow under that tree and just trust God to take care of you. And him and the boy left. So the next night, they come to the next town, and another farm, and they ask the gentleman if they can stay there for the night because they're traveling to a certain city. And the man says crudely, yes, you can, but this is my house, and I'm not letting you stay in my house. You're going to stay out in the barn. And so they stay out in the barn and sleep in the cold, and the guy says thank you, treats them harshly, doesn't give them any kind of clothing, anything to stay warm in, basically treats them like an animal. The next morning, get up, and the father notices that their wall is starting to deteriorate, so he goes to the store and he buys materials to fix their wall. And he gets the stone, gets the mortar, rebuilds the wall for the man. The man doesn't thank him. The man acts like he was entitled to that, and he's rich, had no need, but still felt entitled to this man's work because he let him stay in his barn with the animals. And so the man fixes it, gets the boy to help, fixes it, and they go on their way. And the boy says to the father, he said, Dad, he says, I don't understand, he said. He said, how is it that the person who had the least blessed us with the most, all that he had, and then the next morning lost the most? And he said, and then how is it that the person who had the most offered us the least, and you gave him back the most? You gave him back more. You fixed his wall. And the dad said, son, he said, in this particular case, he said, I'll tell you what is, and seems to be a mystery, but it is the way of God. He said, what can seem as one thing in the eyes of a boy isn't always everything that there is to see. He said, for in fact, he said, I knew that underneath that tree of that first farm was a buried treasure underneath that olive tree. And when that man would go and bury that cow, he would find that treasure, which would actually buy him 2 cows, which would give him the availability to produce twice as much milk for his provision. For, he said, when he gave me the milk the night before, I tasted it that it was bad, and had he eaten the cow, which seemed like the right thing to do, it actually would have killed him and his wife. And the boy said, oh, wow, didn't know that. He said, but what about the rich man who treated us so cruelly? And he said, well, son, he said, as we were going out into the barn, I noticed that his wall was broken down. And inside that wall, I saw a treasure. And I knew if that rich man would fix that wall, he would find that treasure. But he would not use that treasure for other people, but use it for greed and treat others cruelly and only use it for himself. And so the boy was like, oh, right? And the reality is, for us in this life, that's a really true picture of what is and can be. sometimes when we see things, we say, that's not right. That's not just and that's not right. But we're leaving out, in the equation, we are leaving out God. Right? And there are things that God is doing, and there are things that God sees that we, on this side, cannot comprehend. And so we have to be careful in relation to how we judge things as we see them on this earth. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't give us glimpses into what He is doing, just like that man did with that boy. And the Song of Moses kind of does that, because it's actually a preview of what's going to happen not only in Joshua, but then what's going to happen in Judges. So when you see Judges, we're going to reflect back to Deuteronomy 32 and say, oh, okay, I see that what he said in the Song of Moses is actually now taking place here and now, right? So that's really how the psalm or the song functions in relation to that. So Deuteronomy 32, 28. Actually, go back to 25. He says, outside the sword will bereave, and inside terror, both young man and virgin, the nursling and the man of gray hair. I would have said, I will cut them to pieces. I will remove the memory of them from men, had I not feared the provocation by the enemy. So the enemy is going to do this. They're going to come in and they're going to take out at periods and times God's people, youngest to gray hair, right? And they're going to take that out, and they're going to be that aspect of discipline. But, however, verse 27, but had I not feared the provocation by the enemy. What's the enemy going to think about that, though, when they do that? Right? See, in any given act, God is doing millions of things. But at the top of that list is He is going to uphold His name for His glory's sake. In other words, His character and nature of who He is. So it's not just what's happening with His people, but what is also the people that discipline, that overcome Israel. How are they going to see this? And God cares about that. When God was going to take out His people because of their grumbling and griping, Moses came in and he interceded on behalf of the people. How did he do that? He said, God, these are your people, and oh, by the way, what will the people of Egypt say and think, and what will the people in the Promised Land who heard about you and what you're doing with your people, what you did and what you were doing with your people? What they will say is, you as their God couldn't get it done. They probably don't know anything about your covenant. They don't know anything about your promises. They don't know anything about your way. But you are a God who took your people out from slavery just for them to die in the wilderness. And that's what those outside groups of people are going to say. That's what they're going to think about you. And so then what does God come in and do? He says, yeah, so I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. Now, Israel was saying, we can't go and conquer that people because they're too mighty, too great, too strong, and our children will die. So what does God do? He takes the group of men who may have thought that in their own strength they could have done that, and He leads them into the wilderness and takes all of them out, older generation, and He says to them, but your children are going to go in. In other words, there's a sense in which I can take a group of kids and accomplish whatever I want to accomplish because it's not in your strength that you're going to get where you need to get. You're saying that your children are going to die. Your children are the ones who are going to see the Promised Land. Right? So what you think about me matters. Now, what is the other nations when they see that? What are they going to think? Are they going to attribute it to you and your strength, or are they going to attribute it to me as your covenant God? Well, guess what? They're going to see that, and they're going to say, there's no way that should have all happened. Their God did that on their behalf. So it's all about the name of God. Well, when you fast forward now, they enter the Promised Land, and now they rebel against God, act unfaithfully before God. God then judges them, Book of Judges, but that group of people that judge them, what are they going to think? They're going to think that they are the ones who did that. God is impotent. He can't protect His own people. So what's God going to do? He's going to judge that group of people because, no, you didn't do it by your own strength, even though you didn't know that. Right? Now, we see an example of this in 1 Samuel. Because you remember when the people were going out against the Philistines, there was this whole back and forth battle. The Philistines won. What did they do with the Ark of the Covenant? Put it in their temple. But then what did God do in relation to that temple? Their God, head rolls out on the ground. Right? It has nothing to do with your God being powerful. Right? And so you've got that going on. So he's saying, what are they, the enemy, I'm going to use to discipline my people? I'm going to now judge them as well because of this. Because they're going to say, verse 27, they would say, our hand is triumphant, and the Lord has not done this at all. Now, stop and think about that in terms of your life and my life. In essence, what that means is there is nothing and no one who touches us that does not pass through the hand of God in terms of what He's doing. Nothing. All of life's activities are within the hand of God in relation to that. And God does not, we see a conflict with that, but God does not see a conflict with that at all in relation to that. So just an amazing thing. But that's what they're going to say. They're going to say, Lord's not done this. We did this. Right? And so what's God going to do with them? He's going to judge them. Right? He's going to judge them. So why? Verse 28, for they are a nation lacking in counsel. There's no understanding in them. That they were wise, that they understood this, that they would discern their future. How could one chase 1,000? You remember when God promised to, and actually I may be getting crossways just a little bit. Actually, no, He just said this in 1st of Deuteronomy. He says, they're stronger, they're mightier, they're greater than you, but they're going to take flight as one who is pursuing 1,000. So you come in as one, there's 1,000, and they go and they flee. Well, who does that? That's not supposed to happen, right? You remember with Elisha and I believe it's Elisha, they're in the middle of a famine, and the lepers are outside the city, and the lepers basically make a decision. We got one of two options. We're going to die here. We can't go into the city, or we can go to the enemy. Maybe the enemy will be happy with us and treat us well, better than what we do today. At least we won't die. And if we do, we die. So we die one way, we die the other. They go in, and that night, God caused the enemy to hear a noise, and they said, they've hired out another nation to come up against us, and they left the camp. So the lepers come in, not one sword is raised, not one arrow is shot, and they come in and feast. All right? Feast. Well, who does that? A wise person would say, well, that's not human. That's not human. Well, that's what God did with Israel as they're going to enter into the promised land. He's continually doing this. And we're going to find when they enter the promised land, it's only when they think about their strength and, oh, this is no big deal, our might, our strength, that they start running into problems. So everybody then, when they're seeing that, they're attributing that to God, which is the way that God works. Well, translate that over into your own life. If you can figure it out, how you're going to get out of your problems, who's generally going to get credit for that? Yeah. So there's a true sense in which your circumstances have to be impossible for you in order for, number one, you to realize your need upon God, but also when it happens, God gets credit. But now, if you've had this happen to you before, you've had situations in your life where you've said, that was God. That was God. And so you go and tell somebody about it. They ask about, say, your health or whatever. I mean, we've all got stories, right? And, how did this happen? Man, you just wouldn't believe it. Da, 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 da. God did this, God did that, God did that. And they get that look. Yeah. And you're like, no, really. God did this. And like, yeah, the stars aligned, you won the lottery, you know what I mean? And it's like we'll attribute it to anything, but just natural reason you'd realize there's something else going on here besides that. And as Christians you say, yeah, it's God, right? But someone who is not discerning, and the New Testament will show us that this is where God lifts a veil for them to truly see, then what are they going to do? They're going to write it off. They're going to write it off. Well, a nation that would look at Israel and say, this is how did these group of people, these ragtag group of people, how did they get the land that they've got? Flowing with milk and honey. Mighty men live there. How did they get from the mightiest military nation at the time released from there? And they retrace all of that. Well, you'd have to say their God. But now whenever God, because they then go south, and God says, I'm going to use you to overcome them. The natural thing that a man should say is, God's doing that through us. Their God's doing that through us, because otherwise, guess what? That God didn't all of a sudden just become lost and void and gone. So what's he basically done? He's removed their protection and he's brought us in to take them out. And they would attribute their victory to God. Why? Because they won 1 versus 1,000. Doesn't matter if we're 1,000 to 1, because their God's already shown he can overcome any odds. But that nation that comes in and does that, do they attribute that work, their work, to God? What do they say? We've done this. We've done this. So now they've taken credit for what God has done at their hand. So what's God going to do with them? He's going to judge them. And rightfully so. Rightfully so. He shares his glory with no one. So they would they have been wise, verse 29, they would have understood this, that they would discern their future. How could one chase 1,000 and two put 10,000 to flight, unless their rock had sold them and the Lord had given them up? In other words, that's what they should think. That's what they should think. They should think that their protection, their, what is it, if y'all are sci-fi people, their gravitational force has been removed, right? We can now attack, Who is their gravitational force? Their rock, their fortress has sold them. That's what they should think, but they don't. They don't. Indeed, their rock, talking about now people like Philistines and all of them, their rock is not like our rock. Even our enemies themselves judge this. Because their vine is from the vine of Sodom, and from the fields of Gomorrah, their grapes are grapes of poison, their clusters bitter. Their wine is the venom of serpents and the deadly poison of cobras. Is it not laid up in store? Is it not laid up in store with me, sealed up in my treasures? Vengeance is mine, and retribution. In due time their foot will slip, for the day of their calamity is near, and the impending things are hastening upon them. So their judgment is going to come. Their judgment is going to come. They don't. New Testament, Jesus comes in and says, "You say what you say because of your Father. If you were from my Father, you would receive me as Messiah, but you don't receive me. Why is that? Because your father is the devil." Right? Why is it that a people should see and should say their God has given them up to us and credit their God for that? Why is that? It's because of who their Father is. So behind all of this is spiritual warfare of what's happening. All that's spiritual warfare of what's going on in relation to this. It's why they don't see and give tribute, if you will, to God as they ought to. And that's what you're going to find. What do they do with Samson? What do they do with Samson? Yeah, they tie him up, and in the end, they're tying him up, and what are they having a festival for? They're gods. They're gods, right? They're not giving credit. Do what? That's see, and that's the thing. They're not seeing that God gave Samson up to them. They're saying our gods are the ones who have given us victory, right? Which is it's really interesting, because if you think about that, what's going on with all the plagues in Egypt? What's God doing with all the plagues in Egypt? He is showing that He is God over every god that you're placing faith, trust in, and attributing power to. And there's no power. Your God is impotent. There's no power in your little g God. Sun God, frog God, Nile God, fertile God. You're worshiping an entity that has no power. So the natural thing would be you should attribute even your conquering of my people. You should be attributing that to me. But that's just not the case. Why? Because of who their father is. So 36, the Lord will vindicate His people. He will have compassion on His servants when He sees that their strength is gone and there is none remaining, bond or free. And He will say, where are their gods, the rock in which they sought refuge? So God saves Israel when there's no strength, there's no one to help, there's no one left, bond or free. And again, this is a preview to the book of Judges. They cry out, and they have no strength. They have no way out, and God comes in and delivers them. Yeah, God comes in and delivers. And again, Samson's a good picture of that too. Samson is tied up. Lord, I've looked upon me. I've done wrong. He is tied up, being made a mockery, blinded to serve in their mill, and now they've brought him out to play, for them to play with. And God looks upon him, and it's not because of Samson's strength that more Philistines are killed that day than they were in any day that Samson was alive. So it's not Samson who is doing all of that as deliverer. It's the God of Samson. Well, that's what this is saying. That's what's going on. They're attributing their victory to their God, and God says that's wrong, and I'm going to judge that, rightfully so. And mine, who is mine, child, who now is absolutely helpless, with no way out, I'm going to act upon them, because what's he doing now in his moment of humiliation? What's he doing? He's not saying, shaking fist up to God, you did me wrong, God. It's interesting, isn't it? He's not saying, you dealt me a bad hand, God. He's not doing that, is he? And what does God do? He acts on his behalf. But he's not doing it because of any kind of strength from him. He's doing it on behalf of his name. And is that right then to judge the Philistines? Because you could say, well, look at Samson. According to his covenant, he did all the wrong things in relation to his covenant. He deserved that punishment in relation to the covenant of God. So how are you going to judge the Philistines? Because the Philistines are doing what? They're not attributing anything to God. See? So on their own standard, their own level, they're guilty. So God comes in and judges them. Why is he doing that? Because of who they're attributing that victory to. So, um, so, but they're seeing now that the gods that they've turned to, they have no power at all. So it's incredibly important because you think about the time in which we live. Man has a tendency, post-fall, man has a tendency to place faith in entities and people and things other than God, who are not God. Those things are not God. They have no power. They have nothing other than what God has given to them. There's a lot talking about Biden coming into play. There's nothing that's going to happen there in relation to government that God is not directing. We don't fear those things because we don't have to, right? And anything that comes upon us, one, will be justly due, and two, we're still His. We're God's. Any kind of discipline that comes about, God is still our God, and it does not mean that they have any kind of strength. You love it when Jesus comes in and the thief on the cross. If you're God, save yourself. So, Jesus doesn't say, "I should have thought of that." What was I thinking? You're right. I am. He's like, really? I mean, I could call legions of angels. I have. You talk about supernatural power, right? I have universal power over this moment, right? And I'm restraining that. Why? Because it's the Father's will and therefore my will, right? So there's nothing happening to me that I am not in control of. Well, guess what? We are co-heirs with Christ. There's nothing happening to us that God is not fully in control of. Fully in control of. And it is all right. Many of it's hard, but it's all right and good. The thing that we've got to just continually keep our focus on is our God, His greatness, goodness, and His steadfastness, right? Because even a remnant within a people who have turned away from God, they face the consequences of what the whole is doing. You see this with Jeremiah. Jeremiah is the one who is standing as light in the middle of darkness, and the darkness is Israel. Okay? And Israel is being disciplined as a son, and Jeremiah, who is standing rightly before God in the midst of that, is being disciplined with them. Right? And that's a very hard thing, but it's not a bad thing. It's actually for him an eternal weight of glory, right? And so he dies in Egypt, and so we want to understand the steadfastness of God and who we place our faith, trust in, and no matter whether that's light within the church or light within the world, and the reality is, if you're light within the church, you're going to be light within the world too. But a lot of times we just think about that light being light in the world. No, we want to be light everywhere that we are. And so if the earthly idea of church, which I don't know that is actually church, but if the earthly idea of church is we're moving to a time in which we're being light even within that darkness. Okay? And then the discipline of God can come in for that. But anything we face in there is not outside the hand of God, and it's not because God does not have control or power over those moments. So we have nothing to fear in relation to what comes into our lives, because we are trusting in God who is faithful to carry us through that in relation to that. So our focus has to be on the Savior of that. We just got to make sure that we do not turn to these cultural ideas and idols and say that's what's going to save us. That's what scares me the most about what's gone on the last 4 years. I'm just going to be honest with you. Because it's very easy to transfer now and say, that's what's going to save us. No. Not saying God can't use people in those positions, or we don't want to vote people in positions that are more closely aligned with God. I don't know even if you say that he was or not. But point being is it was very easy to slide into that. We're not trusting in any sort of government or any sort of people to be our powerful Savior. We're trusting in the God of the Bible. And this is showing all of that. So it's good for that. 38, who ate the fat of their sacrifice, drank the wine of their drink offering? Let them rise up and help you. Let them be your hiding place. See now that I am He. There's no other God besides me. It is I who put to death. It is I who give life. I have wounded. It is I who heal. And there is no one who can deliver from my hand. Indeed, I lift up my hand to heaven and say, as I live forever, if I sharpen my flashing sword, my hand takes hold on justice, I will render vengeance on my adversaries, and I will repay those who hate me. I will make my arrows drunk with blood, and my sword will devour flesh with the blood of the slain and the captives from the long-haired leaders of the enemy. Rejoice, O nations, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants and will render vengeance on his adversaries and will atone for his land and his people. So his enemy is the enemy of Israel. Now notice, it's not because of their repentance, not in this passage, but because of his grace. He's going to go out to judge Israel. And when he judges Israel, he is right. And when he judges the people who judge Israel, he is right. And all of that is in his power. And just because things don't proceed the way we think that they should proceed does not mean that he is not in control and over that. And it's just a strong passage about that. Just an incredibly strong passage. I do what I do because I'm God. Right? And you, the people of God, who have tasted the goodness of God, should show that loyal faithfulness to God. You've tasted the goodness, and you should show that. But what did you do? You went and you attached yourself to little g gods, acting as if they had some sort of might and power. And you get judged for that. Why? Because they don't. Where are they now? As I'm judging you, where are they now? And it's just showing you that there's no power in those things. So now what happens when you're totally helpless, you will find, God then comes in and he judges the people who judge them. Why? You should have attributed your victory to me, but you didn't. You didn't. You're acting like your God has power too. Little g God. He does not. The only reason you got what you got is because I gave it to you. So you can, you think about the implications. You can look at the evil wins. No. God gave that over for his purposes that we may not fully understand today, but it's God who's over all of that. And oh, by the way, the evil that they did to get where they've gotten will be judged by God. Rightfully so. Why is that? Because they're attributing that to their God. So you take that over into, it's easy right now because we're kind of in that political whole thing. That other, LGBTQT, whatever, they're naming it now. The whole, gender thing, all of that's, is a whole little g God, powerful. We're going to come in and we're going to take over. Well, guess what? Whatever they take over, if you will, they'll attribute it to their God, little g God. And they'll claim it as a victory. And guess what? No. Whatever God is doing in the midst of that is oppressing His people, God is the one who's doing it. And oh, by the way, guess what? You're going to be judged for that one day. Why is that? Because you're attributing it to your little g God. So, for a Christian, it's a win-win. It's a win-win. Just make sure that we understand who it is that we are worshiping and don't turn away from who our God actually is, right? As far as that goes. So it's this song is one of the most powerful passages that shows the history of Israel, past, present, and future, that says God is over all of this. What He is doing is right, it's good, and it's just. And here's why. And you don't see that very often where you have such a concentrated passage that talks about the history of Israel in relation to the work of God. What they're doing, what Israel's doing, what then the adversary is doing, and then what God is doing in that. But this song does. So he says this in verse 44. Moses came up, spoke all the words of this song in the hearing of the people, he with Joshua son of Nun. When Moses had finished speaking all these words to Israel, he said to them, Take to your heart all the words which I am warning you today, which you shall command your sons to observe carefully, even the words of this law. I was amazed again reviewing today how many times God says to keep and obey the law. Keep and obey the law. Keep and obey the law. This is the way you ought to conduct yourselves in light of what I've done. So he goes through all of this, and then he issues back to them, this is the way that you should respond to that which I have done. Okay? He said, For it is not an idle word, verse 47, indeed, it's your life. That's where I say whenever we talk about the commands of God, it's a discipline of freedom. And I may tweak that a little bit because our idea of freedom, I don't know, is the same freedom as what God's is. It may be a better definition of saying it's a discipline for life. In other words, it brings true life in relation to that. Keep these words. Why? It's not an idle word. It's your life. And by this word you'll prolong your days in the land which you are about to cross to the Jordan to possess. The Lord spoke to Moses that very same day, saying, Go up to this mountain of the Abiram, Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, opposite Jericho. Look at the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the sons of Israel for a possession. Then die on the mountain where you ascend, and be gathered to your people, as Aaron your brother died on Mount Hor, and was gathered to his people, because you broke faith with me in the midst of the sons of Israel. Isn't that interesting? Right? He didn't say you disobeyed my command. He said what? You broke faith. You broke faith. In the midst of the sons of Israel, at the waters of Meribeth Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin, because you did not treat me as holy in the midst of the sons of Israel. For you shall see the land at a distance, but you shall not go there into the land which I am giving to the sons of Israel. So you now have the moving. Moses is now fixing to move off of the scene. He sees it from a distance, but doesn't taste it until the next life. And the reason is because he broke faith with him. And then we're going to find in 33, and I don't know that we're going to go through all of that. We may highlight some of this stuff next week, but now you've got the blessing from Moses to Israel. So it's like the commissioning of what's going to go on. And as he's commissioning them, he's saying, okay, now you carry on in light of the promise that God's given. Carry on and be blessed and prosper in the promised land. And it's going to be kind of an ushering in. It's a closing of the Pentateuch, but it's the ushering in now of entering into the promised land. And it's now ushering in that next step in the progression of what God is doing in the life of Israel and moving forward. So 33 is going to do that, and it's going to carry us basically to the end where we're going to have a transfer now from Moses to Joshua, and then Joshua we're going to see kind of a renewal, but also the same but different for that generation as we go into Joshua. So yeah, 32 is just a great passage. Be sure and highlight it, mark it in your book in terms of just the progressive plan of God and how God is truly just in all of his dealings and in control of all things. Okay. All right, let's have a word of prayer. Father God, so grateful for your word, so grateful for the way in which you work. Father, just to have you as our God who is over all things, in control of all things, directing all things. Even the things that come into our lives as disciplines, Father, are in your power and in your control. And Father, even those things that come in, it's evil on their behalf because they're not attributing that work to you, and you will judge that as well. And so, Father, truly, our love and the totality of our focus really should just be on you. And we pray, Father, that you will just grow that in our hearts, in our minds, and in our lives for your glory, for your honor, for your praise. These things we pray in your Son's holy name. Amen.